Marcus Johnson was not the kind of man who liked attention. He had built a career in the FBI based on discipline, patience, and a quiet strength that impressed everyone who worked with him. In his late 30s, he carried himself with dignity, often described by his colleagues as the kind of agent who spoke softly but always got things done. That evening, Marcus was not on duty. He had traveled back to his old neighborhood to visit his mother, who had recently been feeling unwell. The streets of that part of the city were familiar to him. He had grown up there, played basketball in the parks, and walked those same sidewalks as a boy. It was late when he left his mother's house, the air cool and quiet, the street lamps buzzing faintly in the darkness. Marcus parked his car near a small convenience store, stepped out, and locked the doors behind him. He was dressed casually: dark jeans, a jacket, and sneakers. In his wallet was his FBI badge, something he carried everywhere, not because he wanted to show it off but because he knew life could be unpredictable. That simple piece of identification could explain who he was if ever a situation arose. But Marcus had no idea that this night would be one of the most dangerous moments of his life. Down the street, a police cruiser was slowly making its way through the block. Inside the car sat Officer Richard Miller, a man with a reputation that most people in the neighborhood knew all too well. Miller had served in the department for nearly 15 years, but instead of being respected, he was feared. He had been accused multiple times of using unnecessary force, targeting certain groups unfairly, and speaking in ways that made people uncomfortable. Complaints had been filed, but somehow he always managed to stay on the force. He had friends in the right places and a badge that seemed to protect him from real consequences. When Miller saw Marcus walking, he narrowed his eyes. In his mind, Marcus looked like someone who didn't belong, an outsider, a potential problem. Without a second thought, Miller pulled the car to the side and stepped out, hand resting on his holster as if danger was already near. "Hey, you! Stop right there," Miller shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus turned, surprised by the sudden confrontation. He stayed calm, as he always did in tense situations. "Officer, is there a problem?" he asked, his tone respectful. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreperson stood with the verdict paper in hand. The air felt the weeks after the sentencing carried a sense of change across the city. For years, people had grown used to cases like this ending quietly, with little accountability. But the harsh sentence given to Officer Miller had shifted the air. Newspapers called it a turning point. Television hosts described it as a message to the nation. Social media overflowed with posts praising Marcus Johnson's courage. For once, people felt that the system had not completely failed. Marcus, however, lived each day with a different reality. His recovery was long and painful. Every morning he struggled to stand, his body stiff and sore from the damage the bullet had done. Physical therapy became part of his routine, and though progress was slow, he pushed himself with determination. He told himself that if he had survived that night, he owed it to himself and to others to keep moving forward. His mother often sat beside him during therapy sessions, cheering him on with gentle words. "One step today means 2 steps tomorrow," she would say. His FBI colleagues visited regularly, encouraging him with stories from work, sometimes even bringing small jokes to lighten the mood. They wanted him to know he was still part of their family, even if he wasn't on the front lines anymore. As Marcus regained strength, he began to receive invitations to speak at community events. At first, he was hesitant. He was not a man who sought the spotlight. But he realized people needed to hear his story, not just the details of the night he was shot, but the truth about resilience, justice, and hope. When he finally agreed, his first public appearance was at a town hall meeting. The room was filled with people: young students, community leaders, activists, and even fellow law enforcement officers who wanted to show support. When Marcus wheeled himself onto the stage, the room erupted in applause. He waited quietly until it settled, then spoke in his steady, calm voice. I stand before you not because I am stronger than anyone else, but because I survived, he began. I survived an act that should never have happened. But I also survived with a purpose. My story is not just my own. It belongs to every person who has felt unseen, unheard, and unprotected. We cannot change the past, but we can change the future together. The audience rose to their feet, clapping loudly, many with tears in their eyes. From that moment, Marcus' role shifted. He was no longer just an FBI agent recovering from an injury. He became a voice for reform, a symbol of justice and endurance. Across the city, changes began to take shape. The police department introduced new oversight programs, stricter training, and community review boards. For the first time, citizens were invited to sit at the table where policies were discussed. The city council passed measures that required officers to undergo more thorough evaluations and accountability checks. These steps did not erase the pain of the past, but they gave people hope for the future. Marcus continued to speak at schools, universities, and conferences. He told his story with honesty, never exaggerating, never minimizing. His words touched both young and old, inspiring many to believe that one person's courage could create ripples of change. He often reminded people that he had once been just a boy in the same neighborhood where the shooting happened. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone, he would say. That's why we must never stop demanding fairness. At home, Marcus still faced his personal battles. Nights were the hardest. Sometimes he woke in cold sweats, hearing the echo of the gunshot in his mind. The memory of the flashlight in his face, the command to get on the ground, and the sudden pain of the bullet haunted him. But each time, he reminded himself that he had survived for a reason. His pain had not been wasted, it had sparked a movement. Letters began arriving from across the country. Some were from people who had experienced similar encounters but had never been heard. Others were from young people thanking him for his bravery. One letter from a teenager read, "Because of you, I want to become a lawyer and fight for justice." Another from a retired officer said, "Your strength has reminded me why I wore the badge in the first place, to protect, not to harm." Marcus read each letter carefully, often with tears in his eyes. He kept them in a box, not because he wanted to be reminded of his suffering, but because they gave him strength to continue. Every letter was proof that his story had reached hearts far beyond his city. Meanwhile, Officer Miller began serving his sentence. News reports occasionally covered updates from the prison, showing a man who had once carried authority now stripped of it completely. The harsh sentence served as a warning to others in uniform that power could not protect wrongdoing forever. While Marcus did not celebrate Miller's suffering, he understood the importance of accountability. Justice, he believed, was not about revenge but about responsibility. As months passed, Marcus grew stronger. He began walking again with the help of a cane. Each step was a victory, each day a reminder that he had beaten the odds. He returned to FBI headquarters, not as a field agent, but as a mentor and advisor. Younger agents looked up to him, listening closely to his words about patience, integrity, and courage. His story carried lessons no textbook could teach. One afternoon, standing before a group of recruits, Marcus told them, "Wearing a badge is not just about authority. It is about responsibility. It is about serving people with fairness, not with fear. Remember that every person you meet has a story, and it is your duty to respect it." The recruits listened in silence, some visibly moved. His voice had become more powerful than ever. Years later, people still remembered the case. Documentaries were made, books were written, and students studied it in classrooms. But for Marcus, the most important legacy was not the headlines, it was the quiet changes in everyday lives. Communities felt safer speaking out. Officers thought twice before acting out of anger. Young people grew up believing that justice, though sometimes delayed, was possible. On a warm evening, Marcus visited the same street where it had all begun. He stood quietly, leaning on his cane, looking at the familiar houses and the corner where his life had nearly ended. Neighbors came out, greeting him warmly, some hugging him, others simply nodding with respect. Children played nearby, laughing, unaware of the history that had unfolded on that pavement. As Marcus looked around, he felt a mix of emotions: sadness for what had happened, but gratitude for what had grown from it. He knew scars would remain, both in his body and in the city's memory. But he also knew that scars were proof of survival. He whispered softly to himself, it wasn't in vain. Then he turned, walking slowly but firmly toward his car, his head held high. He was no longer just the man who had been shot by a racist officer. He was the man who turned pain into progress, who transformed tragedy into a voice that could not be silenced. And in that moment, Marcus Johnson understood that while one night had nearly destroyed him, it had also given him a new purpose, one that would continue to echo long after the headlines faded, a purpose rooted in justice, truth, and hope. Ev, almost as if the entire building was holding its breath. Outside, hundreds of people waited anxiously with signs and cameras, their voices quiet for the first time that day. Inside, Marcus Johnson sat in his wheelchair, his heart pounding, his eyes fixed on the jurors. His mother squeezed his shoulder gently from behind, whispering a silent prayer. Across the room, Officer Richard Miller sat at the defense table, his face pale but stubbornly expressionless, his eyes darting between the jury and the floor. The judge nodded for the foreperson to read. The words came slowly, each one echoing like a bell. On the charge of attempted murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A gasp rose from the crowd. Miller blinked rapidly, his lips pressing tightly together. On the charge of abuse of power under color of law, guilty. Murmurs filled the courtroom. On the charge of violating civil rights through the use of force, guilty. The words hung in the air, final and undeniable. For a moment, there was silence. Then tears spilled down Marcus' mother's cheeks. She leaned forward, whispering, "Justice, my son. Justice." FBI colleagues nodded firmly, some even letting out small sighs of relief. Marcus closed his eyes, a wave of emotion rushing through him. He had endured weeks of testimony, questions, and reliving his trauma. Now, the truth had been recognized. But the most important part still remained, the sentencing. In the days leading up to it, both sides made their arguments. The prosecution demanded a strong sentence, explaining that Miller's actions were not a mistake but a deliberate act of aggression, fueled by arrogance and prejudice. They reminded the court of his long history of complaints, his lack of remorse, and the damage he had caused not only to Marcus but to the trust between law enforcement and the community. If there is ever a case that demands the maximum sentence, the prosecutor said firmly, it is this one. The defense, however, begged for leniency. They argued that Miller had already suffered enough by losing his career and reputation. They painted him as a man who had served for years, claiming that one mistake should not erase everything else. They pleaded with the judge to consider a shorter prison term, suggesting rehabilitation instead of severe punishment. The day of sentencing arrived, and once again the courthouse was filled. Reporters filled every seat, and the crowd outside was larger than ever. Everyone wanted to know what punishment would be handed down. Marcus was present, sitting quietly in his wheelchair. He had prepared a statement, one he hoped would not only speak for himself but for many others who had been silenced. His heart beat heavily as the judge asked if he wished to speak. Slowly, Marcus wheeled himself forward, his voice calm but steady. "Your Honor, members of the court, and to the people who sit here today," he began, "I want to be clear. I am not here to speak with anger. I am here to speak with truth. On the night I was shot, I identified myself as a federal agent. I showed my badge. I followed every instruction, yet I was treated as if my life did not matter. The bullet that entered my body did not just wound me physically, it wounded my faith in the very system I spent my life protecting. But I survived. And because I survived, I will not be silent. I ask this court to deliver justice not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been treated as less than human by those meant to protect us. The courtroom was silent as Marcus returned to his place. His words cut deeper than anger ever could. They carried pain, but also dignity. His statement reminded everyone that this was more than one man's story, it was a reflection of countless lives touched by injustice. Finally, the judge prepared to give the sentence. His voice was firm and deliberate as he spoke. This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the history of the defendant. It is clear that your actions, Officer Miller, were not only unlawful but reckless and motivated by prejudice. The victim, Agent Marcus Johnson, showed restraint, dignity, and professionalism in the face of aggression, yet you chose to ignore clear identification and training. The consequences of your actions nearly cost a man his life. It is the responsibility of this court to ensure justice is served and to send a message that abuse of authority will not be tolerated. The judge paused, glancing toward Marcus, then back at Miller. For the charge of attempted murder, I sentence you to 30 years in state prison. For the charge of abuse of power, 10 years, to be served consecutively. For the charge of violating civil rights, 15 years, also consecutive. In total, you will serve 55 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 40 years. The room erupted. Gasps, cheers, and tears filled the air. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and the crowd outside broke into chants as the news spread. Miller's face went blank, his jaw hanging slightly open in disbelief. His lawyers whispered frantically, but the words meant nothing now. He was led away in handcuffs, no longer a police officer, no longer untouchable. Marcus sat quietly, breathing deeply as the sentence echoed in his mind. It was harsher than anyone had expected. For years, cases like this had ended with light punishments or none at all. But this time, the court had made an example. This time, justice had spoken loudly. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus' mother embraced him, her tears soaking his suit. "You fought, and you won," she whispered. "Not just for yourself, but for all of us." His colleagues patted his back, some shaking his hand, others simply nodding in quiet respect. Outside, the crowd cheered his name, their voices blending into one powerful sound. That night, news channels replayed the judge's words over and over. 55 years. Headlines declared it one of the harshest sentences ever given to an officer in such a case. Analysts debated what it meant for the future of policing, for accountability, and for trust in the system. Some called it historic. Others said it was only the beginning. In his hospital-like recovery room at home, Marcus watched quietly as the news played. He didn't smile, but he felt a deep sense of relief. Justice had been served, but he knew the work was not finished. His scars were still there, his pain still real, and his journey was far from over. Yet, in that moment, he felt something powerful: hope. The harsh sentence had done more than punish one man. It had sent a message to the entire country. No badge, no title, no power would protect someone from the consequences of prejudice and abuse. For the first time in a long time, many people felt that justice had truly spoken. And Marcus, though wounded, though changed forever, knew that his fight had created a ripple that would not be easily forgotten. The chapter of pain was not over, but a new chapter of accountability had just begun. But Miller wasn't listening. He had already convinced himself that Marcus was suspicious. "Hands where I can see them," he barked. The hospital was filled with tension the moment Marcus Johnson was rushed through the courthouse was filled with a heavy silence on the first day of the trial. People lined up outside the building before sunrise, holding signs that demanded justice for Marcus Johnson. News vans parked on the streets, cameras pointed toward the doors, ready to capture every moment. Inside, reporters whispered, families sat nervously, and security officers watched carefully as the room filled to capacity. Everyone knew this was not just an ordinary case. It was a test of truth, accountability, and fairness. Marcus sat in a wheelchair at the front, his face calm but his body showing the struggle he had endured. His presence alone carried more weight than words could. He wore a simple suit, his mother seated right behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The quiet strength in his eyes showed he was not here only for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged in similar ways. Across the room, Officer Richard Miller sat at the defense table. His uniform was replaced by a plain suit, but the arrogance in his expression was the same. He avoided looking at Marcus. Instead, he stared at the floor or whispered to his lawyers. The defense team had built their argument around one idea: Miller had acted in self-defense. They planned to convince the jury that he had reasonably feared for his life. But the evidence waiting to be shown told a very different story. The prosecutor stood tall as the trial began. He explained to the jury that Marcus was an FBI agent, clearly identified himself, showed his badge, and yet was still treated as a threat. He promised the jury they would see proof beyond doubt that Miller's actions were not only reckless but also motivated by prejudice. His voice echoed through the courtroom, each word sharp with conviction. The defense attorney, on the other hand, tried to paint Marcus as uncooperative. He suggested that maybe Marcus had moved too quickly, maybe his words were misunderstood in the dark. He spoke with confidence, but the jury's expressions showed skepticism. Many had already seen the videos shared online. They knew Marcus had shown his badge. One by one, witnesses were called to the stand. Neighbors from Marcus' old street told their stories. "He showed his badge, I saw it," one man testified firmly. "He told the officer he was FBI. The officer didn't care. He pulled the trigger anyway." Another witness, a woman who had watched from her window, described Miller's aggressive tone. "He was shouting, not listening. Marcus stayed calm the whole time. He did nothing wrong." The jury leaned forward, listening closely. Each statement built a stronger picture of the truth. The prosecutor then showed body cam footage collected from the night of the shooting. The video flickered on the screen. Gasps filled the room as the jury saw Marcus raise his hands, speak clearly, and present his badge. Miller's voice on the recording sounded sharp, dismissive, and hostile. Then came the gunshot, sudden and cold. The silence that followed in the courtroom was heavy, broken only by the sound of someone quietly weeping in the back row. When Marcus himself was called to testify, the atmosphere shifted. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as he wheeled himself to the stand. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "I told him I was an FBI agent. I showed him my badge. I asked him to call dispatch to confirm. He refused. He treated me as if I was nothing, as if my words did not matter. Then he fired." His voice never rose, never cracked, but the weight of his testimony was powerful. The prosecutor asked him what he felt in that moment. Marcus paused, looking at the jury directly. "I felt invisible," he said quietly. "I had spent my life serving this country, protecting people, believing in justice. And yet, in that moment, none of it mattered. All he saw was the color of my skin, not the badge in my hand." The courtroom was silent. Even the defense team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus' words were more powerful than any evidence. They were not only about him, they spoke for countless others who had faced the same unfairness. The defense attorney tried to challenge him, suggesting maybe Marcus had moved his hand too quickly, maybe the officer felt threatened. But Marcus remained calm. "Every move I made was slow. Every word I said was clear. I have spent years training people on how to handle tense situations. I followed every rule." He ignored every one of them. The defense attorney lowered his eyes, unable to shake Marcus' steady voice. Throughout the trial, FBI officials attended every session. Their presence in the courtroom reminded everyone that this case carried national importance. They listened intently, sometimes taking notes, sometimes watching the jury's reactions. For them, this was not only about Marcus, it was about sending a message that abuse of power would not be tolerated. As the days went on, the evidence against Miller piled up. Records of his past complaints were brought to light. Citizens who had filed those complaints took the stand, describing his history of aggression, his words, and his attitude. The jury saw a pattern: a man who had been given too many chances, a man who used his badge not to protect but to intimidate. The defense tried to push back, calling fellow officers who spoke in his favor. They described Miller as a dedicated officer and a man who put his life on the line. But under cross-examination, cracks appeared. Some admitted they had heard him make troubling comments in the past. Others admitted that his anger sometimes got the best of him. By the time closing arguments arrived, the case was clear. The prosecutor stood before the jury and said firmly, "This was not fear. This was not a mistake. This was a crime." Marcus Johnson deserved respect, but instead he was treated with prejudice and nearly lost his life. If this is not punished, then what message are we sending to every officer who wears a badge and every citizen who trusts the law? The defense gave their final speech, insisting Miller had simply reacted in a split second, as any officer might. But the words sounded hollow compared to the mountain of evidence. The jury's eyes often turned toward Marcus, who sat quietly, a living reminder of the truth they could see with their own eyes. When the trial adjourned for deliberation, the courthouse buzzed with tension. Crowds outside chanted, waiting for the verdict. Families prayed, reporters whispered into cameras, and the nation held its breath. Inside the jury room, men and women debated carefully, weighing every piece of evidence. It was not an easy task, but the truth had been laid bare in front of them. Marcus waited in silence, his mother holding his hand, his colleagues standing nearby. He felt the weight of every second. This trial was not just about him, it was about justice for all who had been ignored, silenced, or mistreated. His heart beat faster as he thought of the jury deciding his future, and perhaps the future of many others. By the end of that long day, the jury had reached a decision. The courtroom was called back into session. The judge returned to the bench, and everyone rose. The air was thick with anticipation. Marcus straightened in his wheelchair, his eyes fixed on the jurors as they filed in. Miller sat stiffly, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the table. The judge cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, holding the paper that would decide everything. The entire room leaned forward, silent and waiting. What came next would change lives forever. Urgency doors. Doctors and nurses worked quickly, shouting instructions as they pushed the stretcher toward the operating room. Blood soaked through his clothes, and his face was pale, but his chest rose and fell. He was still breathing. Every second mattered. His family, who had followed the ambulance, stood outside in shock. His mother trembled, whispering prayers under her breath, her hands shaking as she clutched the arm of Marcus' younger sister. In another part of the city, the news had already spread. Television channels flashed the headline, "FBI agent shot by local police." Social media was flooded with angry comments, videos from neighbors, and eyewitness accounts. The clip of Marcus showing his badge was already circulating online. People could see he had identified himself, and still the officer had pulled the trigger. The public's reaction was immediate and powerful: outrage, disbelief, and sorrow. Meanwhile, in the hospital waiting room, Marcus' colleagues from the FBI began to arrive. They wore serious expressions, their suits slightly wrinkled from rushing. These were men and women who had worked alongside Marcus on dangerous cases, people who trusted his judgment and respected his character. They could not understand how a fellow law enforcement officer could mistake Marcus for a criminal when he had clearly shown identification. "This wasn't a mistake," one of the agents said quietly to another. "He told him. He showed his badge." That officer knew. The doctors worked for hours. Finally, one came out to speak to the family and colleagues. "He's stable for now," the surgeon said, his voice heavy. "The bullet caused serious damage, but we were able to remove it. He will need time and care, but he's alive." Relief washed over the room, though it was mixed with sadness. Marcus would live, but his life had already been changed forever. Outside, crowds began to gather near the hospital. People carried signs, chanting for justice. Many were from Marcus' old neighborhood, people who had known him as a boy. They told reporters about his character, his honesty, and his lifelong dream of serving the country. "He's one of the good ones," an elderly neighbor said with tears in her eyes. "And look what they did to him." The police department held a press conference that night. Standing at the podium, the police chief tried to calm the storm. He called it a tragic misunderstanding and promised a full investigation. But his words did not convince the public. Too many times they had heard the same excuse. Too many times justice had been delayed or denied. This case was different, though, because the victim was not an ordinary citizen. He was an FBI agent. Inside the FBI office, senior officials held urgent meetings. They were furious. Marcus had served the agency with loyalty, and now one of their own had nearly been killed by local law enforcement. Calls were made to Washington, demanding oversight and action. "This cannot be brushed under the rug," one official said. "The whole country is watching." Back in the hospital, Marcus slowly opened his eyes the next morning. His body felt heavy, and pain shot through him when he tried to move. His mother was sitting by his side, holding his hand. "You're safe now," she whispered, her eyes wet with tears. Marcus blinked, his lips dry, and managed to speak a few words. "What happened?" "You were shot," his sister said softly. "But you're alive. That's what matters." Marcus closed his eyes again, flashes of the night before replaying in his mind. The flashlight in his face. The gun pointed at him. His words ignored. The sound of the shot. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This had not been an accident on the job. This had been prejudice in its rawest form. Over the next few days, investigators visited Marcus in the hospital. They asked him to explain everything that had happened, step by step. His answers were calm, detailed, and steady. Even in pain, Marcus carried himself with dignity. He made it clear that he had shown his badge, he had identified himself, and the officer had refused to listen. At the same time, witnesses from the neighborhood gave their statements. "We saw it with our own eyes," one man told the investigators. "He pulled out his badge. He said he was an FBI agent. That cop didn't care. He just shot him." Their testimonies matched Marcus' story, and the evidence grew stronger. The officer, Richard Miller, was placed on administrative leave, but many felt that wasn't enough. Protesters demanded his arrest. "Chance of justice for Marcus," echoed outside police headquarters. For once, the voices were not ignored. Under intense pressure from the public, the FBI, and national media, the district attorney announced that charges would be filed against Miller. When that announcement came, the city erupted. Some cheered with relief, others cried, and many said it was long overdue. People saw it not just as justice for Marcus, but as a sign that times were changing, that no one was above the law, not even an officer with a badge. For Marcus, however, the days in the hospital were filled with a different kind of struggle. His body was healing, but his mind carried the weight of what had happened. Lying in the hospital bed, he thought about the years he had spent protecting others, upholding the law, and believing in justice. And yet, in one moment, he had been treated like a suspect simply because of how he looked. Colleagues came to visit, bringing flowers and cards. They told him the whole country was behind him. They promised him that justice would be served. Marcus nodded politely, but deep down, he wondered how many others had faced the same injustice without cameras, without crowds, without the title of FBI agent to make people pay attention. His mother often sat beside him, holding his hand. "You are strong," she reminded him. "God kept you alive for a reason. Maybe this happened so others will see the truth. Maybe your suffering will open people's eyes." Marcus listened, and though the pain lingered, her words gave him comfort. He began to realize that his story was no longer just his own. It belonged to the thousands who had been silenced, ignored, or forgotten. His voice could now carry theirs. By the end of the week, the city was in a state of constant discussion. Talk shows debated the case. Editorials filled newspapers. Activists pointed to Marcus' shooting as proof of the need for reform. Even politicians spoke about it, promising to review policies and laws. The world was watching, and Marcus' name had become a symbol of courage and injustice. But for Marcus, the most important thing was healing. Each day he grew a little stronger, though walking was still difficult. Nurses encouraged him, and physical therapy began slowly. Every step was painful, but he pushed forward. His determination inspired the hospital staff, who often said, "He has the heart of a fighter." Late at night, when the crowds outside the hospital had gone quiet, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be a trial, long hearings, and painful questions. But he also knew one thing clearly: he would not back down. He would stand, even if it took everything in him, because the truth had to be told. And so, while his body healed, the stage was being set for the next chapter. The community had rallied, the FBI was watching closely, and the officer who shot him was about to face the courtroom. Marcus was no longer just a victim. He was becoming a voice for change, and the world was waiting for what would come next. Marcus slowly raised his hands. He had been through countless training sessions about encounters like this. He knew how quickly they could escalate. He spoke carefully, trying to de-escalate the tension. "I'm reaching into my pocket. I have identification. I'm a federal agent," Marcus explained. With slow movements, he pulled out his wallet and opened it, showing his FBI badge. Under the glow of the streetlight, the badge gleamed clearly. There was no mistaking it. But Miller's eyes hardened instead of softening. His pride, his prejudice, and his years of unchecked power boiled together in that moment. "Don't play games with me," Miller snapped. "Anyone can flash something fake. You think I'm stupid?" Marcus kept his hands visible, his voice steady. "Sir, this is not fake. I'm an FBI agent. My name is Marcus Johnson. If you radio dispatch, they'll confirm everything." But Miller's breathing grew heavier. His hand rested tighter on his weapon. The silence of the street added to the tension. A couple of neighbors peeked from their windows, sensing something was happening. Marcus felt his heart beating faster, but his face remained calm. He had dealt with dangerous suspects before. He knew how to talk them down. But this time was different. He was not dealing with a suspect. He was dealing with a man who wore a badge but had no control over his temper. Instead of calling dispatch, Miller stepped closer, pointing his flashlight directly at Marcus' face. "I said don't move. Get on the ground." Marcus hesitated. He was an FBI agent. He had done nothing wrong. To drop on the ground like a criminal felt humiliating, but he knew survival mattered more than pride. He lowered himself slightly, still speaking. "Officer, I'm cooperating. Please, just call it in. You'll see I'm telling the truth." The words barely left his mouth when the sound of a gunshot cracked through the night. Miller, acting out of fear or anger or perhaps both, had fired. The bullet struck Marcus, and he fell to the ground, pain surging through his body like fire. He gasped, clutching his side, as his vision blurred. Screams erupted from nearby houses. Someone shouted, "He shot him! He shot that man!" Lights flicked on in windows, and more people rushed to see what had happened. Miller stood frozen for a moment, realizing what he had done, but then quickly tried to regain control of the situation. He shouted into his radio, reporting a suspect down, twisting the story before anyone else could. Marcus lay on the pavement, fighting to stay conscious. He thought of his mother, just a few blocks away. He thought of his career, his colleagues, and the unfairness of being treated like a threat when all he had done was walk down the street. Gathering his strength, he whispered, "Badge, wallet, check," hoping that at least one honest officer would arrive and see the truth. Within minutes, sirens wailed as more police cars arrived. Neighbors pointed at Marcus' badge still lying beside him, insisting he was an agent, not a criminal. Some officers looked shocked as they realized who he was. The tension grew chaotic. An ambulance pulled up, paramedics rushing to lift Marcus onto a stretcher. His breathing was shallow, his face pale, but he was still alive. As they sped toward the hospital, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness. Memories flashed: his first day in the FBI, the oath he had taken, the cases he had solved. He had faced danger before, but never had he expected to be shot by the very people sworn to protect. Back at the scene, Miller tried to defend himself, telling other officers that Marcus had made a sudden move. But with the badge and identification lying on the ground, his story was already crumbling. Witnesses repeated again and again, "He showed his badge. He told him." The officer didn't listen. Word spread quickly through the city. By the time Marcus reached the hospital, the news was already breaking on television and social media. "FBI agent shot by local police officer," the headlines read. Shockwaves rippled across the country. People wanted answers. In the hospital, doctors rushed Marcus into surgery. His family gathered in the waiting room, fear written across their faces. His mother cried softly, repeating his name like a prayer. His FBI colleagues began arriving, their expressions grim and determined. They knew Marcus, and they knew he would never act recklessly. To them, this was not just a tragic mistake, it was an act of prejudice that could not be ignored. As the night grew long, one truth became clear: this was not going to be another story buried in silence. Marcus had survived the first battle, staying alive after the shot. The next battles would be for justice, truth, and accountability. And so, what started as a quiet visit to see his mother had turned into the beginning of a storm that would shake the entire city, the police department, and even the nation. Marcus, the man who had always served quietly in the background, was now at the center of a fight much larger than himself.